So we're very fortunate to have with us today for this Tom Talks installment, Dr. Tom Bellinger. He is a certified professional hydrologist through the American Institute of Hydrology. He teaches environmental science, planning, environmental policy, snow hydrology, and water law at Metropolitan State University of Denver, MSU Denver. He worked previously as a hydrologist with the Bureau of Reclamation and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. He serves as a hydrology technical advisor with the Department of Interior, USAID, working with the Lao People's Democratic Republic government, conducting a hydrologic and climate assessment of the Mekong River Valley. He has served on multiple boards, and he holds a BS in Resources Management and Forestry and an MS in Hydrologic Sciences and Forest Influences from the State University of New York College of Environmental Science and Forestry in Syracuse, New York. He holds a doctorate in organizational management and leadership with an emphasis on collaborative processes in the water resources field. He is a retired naval intelligence officer at the rank of lieutenant commander. So we are fortunate not only to have you on faculty here at MSU Denver, Tom, but to have you today to share your knowledge and insights with us on the topic of water cases before the Supreme Court. So the topic of our conversation today is a trend of the Supreme Court getting more involved in settling water disputes in the United States. This last session, they were scheduled to hear, and it's been bumped because of coronavirus related delays. But the Supreme Court will hear Texas versus New Mexico. But this is only one of 4 cases that are in the pipeline for them to assess. And the buzz or the interpretation seems to suggest that we should get used to this. This might be the new normal, that the Supreme Court will get involved more often in settling water disputes. What do you think about that, Tom?
Well, for the past 100 years or so, the Supreme Court has been involved in a lot of river basin adjudications, so it's an ongoing process. What's a little bit different today is that we're seeing more cases in the eastern United States than in the West. The West has been traditionally an area where people are arguing over the scarcity of water, and the East has a lot more rainfall, and it's not been as much of an issue. But the cases that the Supreme Court is looking at today, some of those are in the West, New Mexico, for example, in Texas. But some of the ones that are in the East are a little bit new. And they're also starting to see cases involving groundwater disputes between different states, which is more unusual. And I think a lot of this is tied to the simple fact that climate change is beginning to affect the East. But the population is growing, the competition for water in the East is growing, and the water laws in the East, because of shortages of water, we're beginning to see a situation where more competition for water, more water cases going to court and ultimately to the Supreme Court.
Yeah, so you touched on climate change as perhaps a driving factor here. We, based in Colorado, scarcity is always defined how we discuss water issues, but as you mentioned, that really hasn't been the case on, in the East and the Midwest. So climate change is definitely having an impact. Would you say that's the number one factor, or what else is contributing?
I think it's probably the number one factor moving ahead in the 21st century. But other factors are feeding into that. The population is growing, the competition is more intense. And since the 1960s, we've also added a new stakeholder, which is the environment. So we're trying to keep water in the rivers for the fish and for the aquatic life. And that's a new stakeholder that wasn't there 50, 60 years ago. So now with increased population, new stakeholders, and climate change as an umbrella factor on top of those things, it's definitely going to be an interesting century. And I think climate change is the big question mark.
So for us sitting here in Colorado, one of the 2 headwater states, but the only one in the continental US, all of our water really belongs to downstream users. We can use a little bit, but we have to steward it wisely for downstream users. How does all of this increased tension stand to affect Colorado?
Well, Colorado is unique that we are a headwater state, as you alluded to. And Colorado, basically the water is leaving our state to other states. So we have some negotiations that have gone in the past, and some of these have been to the Supreme Court, and they're called water compacts or river compacts. So they're basically like treaties or agreements between different states. And we have 9 river compacts of waters that leave our state. And that's essentially a big driving factor. We have more water lawyers in Colorado per capita than any other state, and all these waters leave the state. So we do have some excess waters. The Colorado River, for example, we haven't developed all of our water. So that compact, people are eyeing that water in our state. So as other states that surround us in downstream of the rivers that leave our state, those people are probably going to be more, maybe more jealous of some of the excess water we have in the state, and that could lead to conflict more down the road.
So in some of these cases, past Supreme Court cases, there has been appointed a river master. And this seems to be something that is growing in popularity. And I'm curious if you can tell us what this role is and how a river master is identified and selected.
So river masters have been around for quite a long time. Usually when we are trying to sort out all the water rights and the claims in different basins, if it goes to court, and especially if it's interstate, usually a special master is assigned to adjudicate that river basin. So now on a local basis, we often have water masters, and water masters tend to be the guys or females that are actually monitoring and managing a river, and that might be something within the state. Most times, if we have a dispute on a river that's within, say, the state of Colorado, intrastate, there could be a special master assigned, or maybe that just goes to court. So there's various ways we can solve those, and one of them, the big ultimate ways of doing it, is actually coming up with a compact or agreement. In the cases of the cases that are kind of on the docket of the Supreme Court right now, those are interstate, and therefore the feds have an interest in them because of the Commerce Clause in the Constitution. So the Commerce Clause essentially looks at rivers as natural resources that are shared between states, and they can be used for recreation, fisheries, or commerce in various ways. So that's why the Supreme Court and the federal government has an interest in solving these interstate disputes. So the Supreme Court in these cases picks, usually it's a retired judge, but it could be somebody with knowledge of a river basin. There's been professors that have been special masters in past cases, but usually it's a retired judge, and they will basically oversee the case, oversee all of the arguments and all of the documents and evidence as to how we need to resolve the dispute. And they tend to they'll write a report, come up with a decision, and that's reviewed by, in this case, the Supreme Court. Many times, the Supreme Court will tend to lean towards that special master's decisions. They hold a lot of weight in these cases. But we've used these decades and decades, special masters in these types of cases.
Okay, so it's not necessarily a new type of role, but perhaps just given more interstate conflicts, there are more of them in need now.
Yeah.
Have you ever been asked to be a river master?
Myself, no. Usually a river master or a water master is oftentimes a state job, and you would probably have to apply for it. Okay. I've worked with a lot of water masters. I've been involved with water right negotiations for Native Americans, and occasionally there might be a special master involved in adjudicating a case, and I would be more of a technical support person in those types of cases.
Okay, interesting. So you referenced interstate compacts, and yes, Colorado has 9 of them. The one that seems to be the most popular, perhaps that's the wrong word, the one you hear about most is our namesake, the Colorado River Compact, which dates back to 1922. I don't know if you tuned into our recent Tom Talks, but we had a 2-part series on Colorado's role as a headwater state, and we drilled down into the Colorado River Agreement. And Can you speak just real briefly about, the history of that and why, it's 100 years old? Can it survive? Does it need to evolve?
Well, it's the problem with the Colorado River Compact is the data that they had to develop the compact was maybe 10, 15, 20 years prior to the compact, prior to 1922. And that was a wet period. So when they developed the compact initially, they thought there was about 15.5 million acre feet. Probably the actual average annual flow of the Colorado was about 13.5 million acre feet. So we already over allocated it. And then we actually left out Native American tribes. We left out New Mexico in the original compact. So we had to amend that. So we're still sitting about at that high number. So the Colorado River is already basically short of water as it stands right now. And when Senator McCain was alive, one of the things he had discussed was that maybe we need to revisit the compact. And revisiting the compact and reallocating the water is a huge thing to do. But instead, on the Colorado, what we have done is we've actually added legislation to basically amend how we operate the river. So the Bureau of Reclamation operates the river essentially. We've had some legislation that's tied to development of water in both the upper and lower basins. We've had legislation to make the operating of the river more efficient, to look at endangered species, to including Mexico. So we've kind of amended it without actually going back and rewriting the compact with various laws. Now, reallocating the water, for example, Colorado has excess water that leaves the state, and California was picking up a lot of that water for many, many years. And when Bruce Babbitt was Secretary of Interior about 20 years ago, he said that all the states had to go within their original compact allotments. And that meant states like California had to put the brakes on taking excess water out. So the excess water out of Colorado, we still have that allocation, but we don't necessarily want to develop and build dams to hold that water back. So there's things we can do, such as trade-off water, trade-off credits. It can really be very, very complicated. And that's why, water lawyers exist, and people like me have to do a lot of the technical work on these. So I think we'll probably have to make some amendments to the Colorado, and it might be through new legislation, and it could be through revisiting the compact, but that's kind of in the cards right now.
So with your long history working on water issues as a hydrologist, but also getting involved in, essentially political issues over water and legal issues over water, is there one case that stands out, and you've worked internationally as well as in the US, is there one case that stands out as perhaps the most interesting or the one that you've been most passionate about?
I have worked on a lot of cases in the 17 Western states. Some of the more memorable ones were dealing with Native Americans, trying to get them water that they were not given 100 years ago. But maybe what I'll do is one of the more interesting things that's fresher in my mind is the Mekong River. And the Mekong is a lot like the Colorado River. And what they're doing on the Mekong is they're building dams, they're building hydropower dams. And the country of Laos is essentially going ahead and trying to build as many dams as they can, like 11 main stem dams and hundreds of small tributary dams for hydropower. And that river has a lot of it's one of the most biodiverse rivers in the world. It has, it's international. It has all those features, and there's also a lot of money involved. So that one reminds me a lot of Colorado. Matter of fact, Cambodia has decided not to build any dams, but a friend of mine flew over the Mekong about a month ago and said, it looks like the Colorado River right now. It's kind of a brown, muddy, getting a little bit smaller type of river. And the competition for that water for fisheries, it feeds 85 million people. Here, it's used, the Colorado is used for growing crops. It's all very important to society, both in the United States, the Colorado, and the Mekong in Southeast Asia. So I think what we're starting to see with climate change is not only what we're seeing in the United States, but big rivers like in South America or in Southeast Asia that are having the same type of effect, and they don't necessarily have the water laws that we have in place. So they have a bit of an uphill battle, I think, in trying to solve some of their problems. But working in the Western United States has always been fascinating. And it's usually scarcity and not necessarily water quality, but environment's a big part of that. When you go back east, it's a little more water quality is the issue. But now you're starting to see the East having a lot of the issues that the West has with scarcity and competition.
Well, we at the university are very fortunate to have you on faculty, and OWOW is very fortunate to work with you. And just want to thank you again for coming on and sharing your views and your knowledge for Tom Talks. Thanks very much, Tom.
Thanks for inviting me. I appreciate it and I enjoyed it.
Thank you.